George Miller experienced just how easy things would be if dogs could talk. His four-legged friend sat staring straight ahead for days at a certain spot on the wall. It took George quite some time to realize what his dog was looking at, but once he did, he went from one surprise to another. Crosby, George's dog, had been staring at the same spot on the wall for days. He only left this position at mealtime. Even though George had already inspected every bit of wall several times, he decided to get up again and take another look at what was holding his pet's attention. And like all the times before, the dog, Crosby, was convinced George had understood him when he headed for the wall. The happy dog hopped around the room, wagging his tail happily. The inspection had been in vain again. George didn't understand at all. What was wrong with that wall? George Miller, a 29-year-old bachelor, had become very lonely after moving to another city. He decided to go to the shelter and fell head over heels in love with Crosby, who was still a puppy at the time. George loved his four-legged friend, and over the years he learned that a dog is indeed a man's best friend. George had no idea what adventure he would have thanks to Crosby. George hadn't exaggerated a word. Crosby was indeed a very sweet dog. The animal was also very social. Crosby was kind to everyone he met, both humans and animals. Still, he had some favorites, including George's neighbor's cat and dog. For years, Crosby played with his furry neighbors, much to the delight of human onlookers. Unfortunately, disaster struck, and his two best friends died shortly after each other. A huge downer for Crosby, as he was such a social animal. This was the main reason George took him to the dog park so often. That is why it raised many questions for George when Crosby no longer wanted to play with his animal friends suddenly. Instead, he just sat staring at that wall. What was going on? One day, George came home from work. Much to his surprise, his best friend Crosby was not waiting for him in the hall. George sprinted through the house without taking off his coat. Something was very wrong here. Normally, when he came home every day, he was welcomed by a very enthusiastic dog. When George arrived in the living room, he saw Crosby sitting there dead still, staring at the wall. George called his dog, overjoyed that he was okay. There was no reaction from the animal. George decided to crouch next to his friend and look at the wall as well. He didn't notice anything on the bit of wall they were staring at together. After a while, Crosby was done staring, and he finally realized that his owner was home. Crosby behaved quite normally for the rest of the evening, but when George had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, he was surprised to see his dog nailed to the floor again in the same spot. What was wrong with his best friend? What could be seen there anyway? The answer to this question turned out to be very moving. After 5 days of watching his dog be entertained by a blank wall all day, George thought it was enough. It was time to find out what was going on. He got up early and went to the nearest electronics store, where he bought a security camera with the night vision goggles. George plugged the camera in and pointed it at his dog's back and the wall where Crosby was staring. What happened when George looked at the CCTV footage? Crosby didn't stare at the wall all day at all. The footage clearly showed that he only sat there when George was around. When Crosby heard George approach, he quickly sprinted to the living room, where he took his now familiar spot opposite the wall. What was there to see on the wall? What could be hiding in the wall? George couldn't control his curiosity any longer and decided to break a piece of the paneling which was already loose from the wall. There was a hole in the drywall that was now exposed. How did this hole get there? George dug his arm into the plasterboard up to his elbow and felt the inside carefully. He was shocked when his fingers suddenly touched George's fingers, explored the inside of the hole, and found a lot of debris. But suddenly George heard the sound again, not muffled by the paneling this time. George's hand just didn't reach far enough, so he started clearing some of the debris from the hole. He had to find out what was hiding in this hole. It had captured Crosby's attention for 5 days, so it had to be something very special. What was that? His fingers suddenly touched something soft and warm. George withdrew his arm from the hole reflexively and stared at Crosby in disbelief. George's hand disappeared into the hole again, but this time he was wary. He ran his fingers over the bottom carefully until he felt the warm, furry object again. George grabbed the animal and withdrew his hand from the hole. How did this kitten get into the wall? Did this have anything to do with Crosby? The creature was covered in dust and must have been very hungry. That the little cat was thirsty was immediately apparent when George put a bowl of water in front of him. The kitten drank the water greedily. George had a strong suspicion of how the animal had ended up in his house. He gave Crosby a piercing look. Had his four-legged friend sometimes taken this kitten inside his mouth because he no longer wanted to be lonely? But where did his dog suddenly get a kitten? George rang the doorbell of all his neighbors, but none of them had lost a cat. After that, George put up posters in his neighborhood, but these also yielded nothing. You would think that such a cute kitten would be sorely missed by his owner, so George was very surprised to see no response to his inquiries. George only got further in his search when he decided to share a photo with his fellow residents. Several of them indicated that they had seen the cat before. They were convinced that it was a stray kitten because cat owners often do not let their precious animals outside at that age. George decided to take the cat to the vet. He should be able to easily find the owner with the help of the microchip. The vet gave the kitten a thorough checkup. She took blood from the animal, looked in his ears, eyes, and mouth, and did several other tests. The animal turned out to be perfectly healthy but very hungry. While the animal was enjoying its first meal in 5 days, the vet scanned its neck. Unfortunately, the kitten did not have a microchip, which confirmed the suspicion that it was a stray cat. Miller decided to post the photo he took of the kitten on social media, but unfortunately the owner was not found. What would he do? While George thought about what to do with the animal, he let him recover in his house for several days. Crosby loved having such an animal friend around. Still, George decided he didn't want a second pet. The kitten might be cute, but it was an extra responsibility that George didn't want. So he took the cat to the shelter after a few days. The vet told George there was indeed a good chance that the kitten would be euthanized if he left him at a shelter. George remembered how excited Crosby had been and how sweet the kitten had been with him for the past few days. He could not get this over his heart. Was there no other option? You can try to give the kitten away via the internet, but then you run the risk that it ends up with a less loving owner, said the vet. George had grown attached to the animal and realized he had only one real option. He decided to adopt the kitten. The kitten became the newest member of the family he already formed with Crosby. Crosby was thrilled, and the kitten immediately started purring when he got home. In fact, George had realized all along that he wouldn't be able to let go of the cat. George named the kitten Mr. Jingles. Crosby was no longer lonely and loved his new animal friend immensely. The kitten was welcomed with open arms and now finally had a loving home. And all this after Crosby spent 5 days staring at a spot on the wall. Shelters all over the world are chock full. The poor animals that stay here urgently need a new home. If you are not able to permanently adopt a pet, you can always see if you can provide temporary shelter for the four-legged friends. Dogs and cats are our best friends, so you'll get a lot of love in return. There are, of course, other ways to help the shelters. You can donate money, volunteer, or point out the benefits of adopting a pet to other people. Please contact a shelter near you to see what you can do for them.